Now, as we know, the Prime Minister seems like he's heading for a brick wall when it comes to the upcoming federal election. Why? Because it just doesn't matter what he thinks or what he says about how amazing everything is. The reality is that, as we've told you before, Australia's wealth gap is heading towards its worst inequality since the 1950s. As you've heard multiple times, and we've been talking about it for as long as it's been part of the mix, we're in a per capita recession, meaning that, OK, they are able to find a way to say that the country is ever so slightly growing, but not when it comes to you and I, because, put simply, the wages of most normal people is not matching the cost and increased cost of everything. The only exception is often things when it comes to the public service, which has exploded under this government. More than 30,000 people have been hired by the federal government, and everyone working for the public service, including the politicians, have got pay rises. In the case of the politicians, they have got 3 pay rises since the last election. You and I, obviously not the same. In fact, as the Australian newspaper had on its front page this morning, the graph that we may have quickly flashed at you before, but I want you to see again, this is the overall picture about households. We are going backwards. The costs go up, the income goes down, meaning the deficit gets larger. The one thing that the Prime Minister and his Treasurer have said over and over again that is the proof about their incredible economic management is the document where they don't have to actually count everything that they spend. As we know, there are tens, probably hundreds, of billions of dollars which are off budget, much of the spending that Chris Bowen's been putting in place. And as they're able to get a massive increase in iron ore receipts, as they're able to count the profits of the Future Fund, they've been able to say this for the past couple of years.
The Albanese Labor government has delivered a second consecutive budget surplus.
What we've done is produce a budget surplus and followed it up with another budget surplus.
We haven't chosen between cost of living relief or budget surpluses. We've been able to do both.
We have delivered back-to-back budget surpluses.
Order. And for those that are cheering on in the press gallery, they think that that is enough. Now, this is a little bit like the people who thought that Kamala Harris was a chance against Trump because the numbers that were coming out of Washington, well, they were getting better by the week and by the month. The reality, of course, is that while even if inflation, say, didn't go up at all in the next quarter, it has gone up by a significant amount since this government started. Now, they're going to say, well, it's started to come down. But remember, as we've said before, you add one quarter on top of the other quarter, on top of the other quarter, on top of the other quarter, and that's how you end up with eggs that end up costing 30% more than before this mob came to power. Well, this distraction, this excuse looks like it too is about to go up in smoke. The reality is that, as I have told you on budget nights during all of this government's term, the budget is in what is called a structural deficit. That, put simply, they keep adding so much spending to the overall commitments of the federal budget that you need to keep revenue going up by the same amount. But that may well not end up being the case. As you've heard a couple of times, and I want to add a little more to what Peter was explaining to you a bit earlier this evening about access economics. Now, generally speaking, give or take a few billion here or there, they're generally in the same spot as the government, or certainly they're in the right spot more often than not. They say over the next few years that there's a $27 billion difference between the budget where it sits now and the budget about where it's going to go. And that's not extra revenue. In fact, it is extra spending. And this, by the way, is what we should be talking about not over the next 5 to 10 years, but over the next 12 months. The estimates for this year's budget deficit, which Sharma said in May would be $28.3 billion, is more likely to be $33.5 billion. Why? Commodity prices are falling. Company tax collections, as well as inflation, is pushing up the overall cost of government services, meaning the revenue is starting to fall, but the expenses are not. And thankfully, the Financial Review made this even simpler for everyone to get our head around. Now, as you can see, the difference between the blue line, which is where the access economics people are modelling things, versus the red of the Treasury. Now, they say here that while we will be headed towards a budget deficit, Deloitte says it's going to be deeper than what the Treasury says. Now, remember, Treasury often gets it wrong. In fairness, they often undercount. But the suggestion here by Deloitte is that rather than undercounting, In some ways, they are overcounting the rosier picture that the government is trying to pick about its own financial circumstances. And after the next election, things get particularly bad. This is not because the amount of money coming into the government is not at record levels. In fact, if you have a look at the expectations for 2025, 26, 27 and 28, we hit record levels. Now, by the way, just have a look at Australia, 2022, at the change of government. The total government revenue was about $250 billion. They're now at $400 billion in the space of just a couple of years. Now, our population has not exploded, despite the best efforts of this government. However, fiddles and changes to the tax system mean that taxation revenue has increased. But look what has also increased. Back in 2022, $650 billion was how much the federal government was spending. The expectation here is that by 2028, it'll be $850 billion. That's what I refer to as the structural deficit. The spending is exponential in its growth. The revenue, while still heading up very quickly, is not matching the same rocket ship, which is why we get to the intergenerational report, which was released, I think, about a year ago. And this was the insight into Australia's true economic future. And it showed budget deficits every single year, all the way through the 2030s, the 2040s, the 2050s, and the worst budget deficits into our future are in the 2060s. The Australian population by 2060 is expected to be the best part of 40 million people. So the government will be doing a good job of trying to get more revenue because more people equals more taxes, despite the fact that more people equals more pressure on government services. And then you need even more people than that to pay for those government services when the people who are paying tax in 2060 start to retire. It's why Dick Smith refers to it as a Ponzi scheme. So while the Prime Minister has been able to say that because they have been kissed by lightning for a couple of years in a row, oh, it's excellent economic management. But unless you are willing to retool the fundamental ingredients in the budget, then unless you keep having these lucky spikes of income, then the baked-in spending overtakes it and you go to a deficit sooner rather than later. It means that while they stand up today and say, haven't we been amazing, we've either saved or paid off $100 billion worth of debt, that all of that automatically gets thrown away. Because just like inflation is a price increase on top of a price increase on top of a price increase, and some of them may have been this big, on top of some of them that may be this big, on top of some of them that might be this big, it's still a price increase. A budget deficit on top of a budget deficit on top of a budget deficit on top of a budget deficit adds to debt. Can we have a look at those numbers again? The expectations about the 2020s, the 2030s, the 2040s, the 2050s and the 2060s is that the joint keeps going into debt. Every one of those little graphs are not side by side, but instead are on top of each other. So this government may well be running out of excuses, which is why, in part, they are trying to get to an election sooner rather than later, and it's why they will not be delivering a federal budget. Because the most likely outcome of a next federal budget to be delivered in May as expected, March as maybe, is that we would be in deficit. And according to Deloitte, those deficits are deeper and longer than Grim Jim is letting on. As for your circumstances, which have not changed for the past 3 years, and certainly not in the past couple and a bit years, almost 3 years of this government, is the problems when it comes to cost of living. Now, I know for some people boring to keep talking about it, but it is the fundamental vein that is running through any and every problem that exists for many and most Australians. And the Prime Minister, just like about budget surpluses, can pretend that 2 budget surpluses versus 40 years of budget deficits is a reason to trust him. He can say cost of living as many times as he wants. This is how many times in question time alone Labor tried to say it over and over again.
Now, if those opposite really cared about housing and cost of living, they'd support this investment.
In terms of The question that was asked as well about costs and cost of living.
They attack every bit of help that we're giving Australians with the cost of living.
This government promised that things would be better today than when they took office. I show this to you every night because I want this image to be burnt not just into your retina. I want you to go and find it and show it to the friends who would even think about rehiring the people who promised that cost of living would be lower under a Labor government, yet how many indices? It is terrible. Those trying to pay off a house, 12 interest rate rises. Oh, but if it goes back to 11, then somehow magically everyone's going to think the Prime Minister is great at managing the economy. If somehow they can flum yet another budget surplus, somehow we'll ignore the settings that mean we are in for budget deficits for the next 40 years. If it was a company, and thankfully a country is not a company, we all know what the future of that company would be, let alone its board of directors, let alone its CEO. Last night on Q&A, every now and then their bubble gets pierced with somebody talking about the reality of this issue. And if there is a shock result at the next federal election, there are no breadcrumbs that need to be learnt. There is a bakery sitting in the middle of the road.
My husband and I, our grocery shop, the grocery shop is just staggering. And I don't know, personally, knowing a number of people who don't have a house, they're paying rent every week. And if they've got a couple of children, how do they pay rent, pay all these heavy tolls, huge grocery bills, education, medical, the list just goes on. And I think people are getting to the point where they've lost all hope in there being a better way of life than what they're experiencing now.